The Lord will be our refuge for the oppressed, our refuge in times of trouble. And they that know thy name will put their trust in thee.
Hello, everyone.
Hi everyone. Hi
Hi.
Matt. Good to have you on.
Good to have you, Matt.
I hope you've all had a good week. I hope you enjoyed the last couple of sessions that we had in our two series on titles for the Psalms. Took a little break from the context, didn't we, Phil, of following the journey of the whole book of Psalms. But the last time we followed this in Psalm 8, Neil led us in some really interesting thoughts where we were thinking about creation, weren't we? And we were thinking about the authority of God and how his name is excellent in all the earth. And it follows on quite nicely in some of the thoughts that Matt's going to discuss with us this evening. So as we always do, I'm just going to share my screen and just have a quick look as to where we're up to. As we said, we took a little break looking at the titles for the Psalms, and I hope you found that helpful. And I'm going to test Phil tonight to see if he can remember some things that Kevin spoke about last time. But we're still in book 1, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 9 tonight in book 1. So I think we're going to start by getting Phil, if that's okay, just to read for us Psalm 9.
Is this the test whether I read the titles or not, Jord?
It could be Phil, actually, yeah.
Right. So let's read from Psalm 9. To the choir master, according to Laban, a psalm of David. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I'll recount all of your wonderful deeds. I'll be glad and exult in you. I'll sing praise to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne, giving righteous judgment. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the peoples his deeds. For he who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me, O you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk in the pit that they made, in the net that they hid. Their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. Higgaion, Selah. The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail, let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. Selah.
Thanks for that, Phil. So, Matt, would you like to share some thoughts with us on Psalm 9?
Yeah, no, that'd be great. So obviously we're thinking about some psalms for challenging times, and I think this psalm's really interesting with the language that David decides to use, obviously under inspiration from God. And I think he is looking at quite a few examples where people are afflicted by their enemies, or certainly in fear for their own salvation at that point. So I'm just going to pick through a couple of themes. If you're expecting a polished Bible class talk, you're going to be a bit disappointed, but hopefully some insights into the words that he chooses give us some real meat for further consideration, and how he's drawing them into this psalm, I think. I suppose it starts by thinking, when I was looking at this, I noticed that there's a lot of words that aren't used that much. And the first one of those that I wanted to have a little look at was the idea of rejoicing in verse 2. And I was flicking through the places it's used. It's only used 8 times, like in this way. And the first time it's actually used is in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and in the context of Hannah. And it says there in verse 1, and Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in Yahweh, my horn is exalted in Yahweh, my mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation." And so where she says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord," this is because she has been enlarged over her enemies and she has been saved. So we immediately start the psalm with this idea of rejoicing that is used elsewhere in this context of rejoicing because you have been enlarged over your enemies. And many of the uses of this word, there's only 8 I said, are used in that context. And you can see another one in Psalm 5. Probably already covered this ground.
Well, it's good to us to pick up psalms that we've already covered.
So Psalm 5 and verse 10, it says, "Destroy thou them, O God, let them fall by their own counsels, cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee." So these are obviously enemies of God that are being spoken about here. And then verse 11, "But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee." And it's the last part there, the joyful. And it says, "For Yahweh will bless the righteous, with favor will thou compass him with a shield." So it's in the context of prevailing over the enemies. We have this joyful sense that should be seen in that. And also it talks about loving thy name, and we'll come on to that idea in the psalm in a moment. So again, there's rejoicing in this overcoming of the enemy. Again, Psalm 25, I'll just shoot through these because they're quite sort of easy to see the connection, I suppose. In Psalm 25 and in verse 2, I'll read from verse 1, a Psalm of David. Unto thee, O Yahweh, do I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies rejoice over me. It's translated triumph in the AV here. But it's the same as this rejoicing in Psalm 9. So here it's kind of flipped. David's asking for the enemies not to be rejoicing over him, and because obviously it's something that's reserved for righteous people when God overcomes their enemies. So I think it's really powerful, and it's quite rare as well. And finally, I suppose one other quick example in a psalm is Psalm 68. And Psalm 68 says, starting at the beginning there, to the chief musician, a psalm or song of David, let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them also that hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. But let the righteous be glad, let them rejoice before God, yea, let them exceedingly rejoice. And then it says, sing unto God, sing praises to his name, extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Yah, and rejoice before him. So as we read in the psalm, there's some connections with his name as well that's to be known, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. But again, the righteous here are being glad and rejoicing before God.
And I suppose
sorry, Jordan, go.
No, I was just going to say, with connection with what you said with verse 1, it seems to be that the reason the righteous are rejoicing and being joyful is because I presume the rest of the psalm is going to speak about these marvelous works. I suppose that's the case with what we read through Phil as well, which is helpful for us to reflect upon as well, to try and think about the works that God has done for us as we reflect on our lives.
It's a really good point, because I probably didn't set the context that obviously the psalm has got a lot in it about overcoming the enemies and what God has done for us. And I suppose we can obviously think about what he did in Jesus as well. How Jesus overcame death and sin, and we can rejoice in that. And I suppose that's the ultimate pattern of God overcoming enemies for us. He's done that with the Lord Jesus.
Yeah, that's something Neil picked up last time, wasn't it, Jord? About
you took the words out of my mouth there.
We'll just go back a slide for a second, Jord. Something I noted that was interesting, because when I was reading this, verse 2, the word here in this translation, the English Standard Version, the word glad and exult. I'm like, that's not a word that I use very often. I don't think I've ever used it. And all those references you looked at, Matt, when I was looking at in the English Standard Version, also had that. I thought, quick dictionary, look, what's this word, exalt? And it's this sort of rejoicing in triumph, exactly as you've been painting out. Of course, you'd expect that, but sometimes it's hard when you're talking about joy, what's the source of it. But yeah, this word exalt, of rejoicing over your enemies, it's probably why I haven't used it, not something I have an everyday occurrence of, but quite a powerful one. So it'd be great to see how that comes through. And I'm sure, Matt, you'll bring out some other examples of rejoicing over enemies as we progress. Very interesting.
And just while we're on this slide, and based on your point, Phil, sorry, before you carry on, Matt, is because I didn't mention this, and I said I was going to test you, Phil, at the top.
Oh yeah, I thought I got away with the test.
I will recount your wonderful deeds, which is what we're thinking about. And as Kevin looked at over the last two parts of Psalm titles, that I will count your wonderful deeds was what Kevin spoke about, which was just the translator's interpretation of what the text is about. The actual inspired text that Kevin alluded to last week was to the choir master, according to Muthlab in a Psalm of David. So I just thought it was helpful to put that on today. But anyway, that's not our subject for tonight.
Well, interestingly, with the translating editors, they just copied and pasted from the end of verse 1 to put the title there, didn't they, above the actual psalm title. So yes, interesting. No, thanks for the test, Jord. I'm glad I passed. Right, Matt, so we've looked at this idea of rejoicing. Then what comes up then next as one of the big themes?
So I suppose the next thing that I wanted to look at was this idea of in verse 5 of the psalm, it says, "Thou hast rebuked," I think your translation said the nations, which seems to be consistent. I've got heathen here, but we understand what that means. "Thou hast destroyed the wicked and has put out their name forever and ever." So again, we've got the name, and I'll pick up that, I think, a little bit later. But the idea of rebuking the nations was interesting. And I was trying to think of some examples of that. And this rebuking, the same word comes up in Psalm 106, and I think that's quite worth us turning to, because we get some exposition in the psalm about what God has done in the past. And let's have a look here. It says in verse 7 of the psalm, "Our fathers understood not thy works in Egypt. They remembered not the multitude of mercies, but provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. Nevertheless, he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make his mighty power to be known." And again, bear that in mind, again, the name and being known, that's important. And verse 9, "He rebuked the Red Sea also, and it was dried up. So he led them through the depths as through the wilderness. And he saved them from the hand of him that hated them, and redeemed them from the hand of the enemy. And the waters covered their enemies, and was not one of them left." So again, this is not a particularly well often used word in Hebrew. It's only used 14 times in this way in the Old Testament. So it's quite a rare choice of word. It's not just sort of, I don't know, a common way of saying, "Oh, I don't like these people," or "I'm going to put a stop to what they do." This is something quite focused. And verse 9 says he rebuked the Red Sea, and it doesn't actually say that in Exodus 14. So we're getting some exposition here about what God was doing there, which is always exciting when you're getting told something that extra about the account later on in the Bible. So we could go there because we're going to be looking there in a moment.
That's a really good point as well. Sorry, Matt, I think that's a really good point you've made, because I think the Psalms does that an awful lot about giving us a little bit of an insight, like especially with, we're going to come across this hopefully in a few weeks' time, but with the Lord Jesus Christ, we sometimes get a lot of narrative in the Gospels about him, but we don't always understand how he was feeling, and the Psalms seem to really bring that across for us. So I think it's helpful that you've mentioned that in regard to this account in Exodus with the children of Israel.
And I think it's something that the Old Testament does, and the New Testament does an awful lot of providing us with insight into what those passages were, in what they meant, in the Old Testament, and that also gives us a pattern of being able to interpret it ourselves as well. So it doesn't do it for every single thing in the Old Testament, but you can use the model of how Jesus and the apostles talk about those things. And then you can say, okay, well, this is what we should have seen, and this is what the children of Israel should have seen in the law, and those kind of examples, which gives us a pattern to look at it ourselves and understand more the mind of God. So in Exodus 14, it just says in verse 21, "Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and he made the sea dry, and the waters were divided." And I don't know whether, I'm certainly familiar with the idea of the seas being like the nations, and we see that in examples like Matthew 8, which we can have a quick look at in a moment. But often in Scripture, the seas and the turbulence of the seas represents the nations, and what God does here at the Red Sea is he rebukes the sea. We're told that by Psalm 106. He rebukes the Red Sea, and the children of Israel go through on the dry. It's a wonderful image when we realize that the psalm is telling us that the sea representing nations parted and the children of Israel go through. And I think that's what David is drawing on here in the psalm, where it says, "Thou hast rebuked the nations and destroyed the wicked." And because it's such a rare word, you can start to see those links are sort of tighter. And I think that's also shown by Jesus, as I mentioned in Matthew 8. I can just read a few verses there from verse 24. He says, it says, "And behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves. But Jesus was asleep. And his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we perish. And he saith unto them, Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm." So it's quite similar context. There's this threat on the disciples, and there's the threat to the children of Israel with the Egyptians pursuing them. And then we see this salvation come through God's rebuking. And clearly this is what Jesus shows in this example. So yeah, those are the patterns of rebuking that are spotted. There's, as I said, there's 14 references, so people could perhaps look at that in their own time. Something further to explore.
Yeah, it's interesting, this one, compared to some of the others, Jord, isn't it? That he's saying you have rebuked the enemies, you have rebuked the nations. Although it changes a bit later on, some of the ones we've looked at so far.
He's not asking God, is he, at the moment to rebuke? He's dwelling on what God has done. That's a good observation there, yeah.
And sometimes that is a powerful thing, because I think later on he was asking to be gracious, but when you can reflect on the way God's worked in the past, either in your own life or in this case, perhaps in the lives of others, or thinking right back to the Red Sea, it can give you more confidence that it's the same God working today. And you can reflect on different ways he has done that in the past to draw strength for now.
Yeah, and we can further build on the Red Sea theme and what God did there with the Egyptians, because twice in the Psalm we have this idea of the enemies being returned. We could perhaps quickly look at that while we've got kind of Exodus 14 in one finger and Psalm 9 in the other. So in verse 3 it says of the Psalm, this is, "When thine enemies are turned back, or they return, they shall fall and perish at thy presence." And then at the end of the Psalm it reflects on that again, and it says, "The wicked shall be returned unto Sheol," or a translation of hell and grave and those sorts of things. And the nations, and all the nations that forget God. So again, it's picking up on the nations. And really interestingly, in Exodus 14, this is what happens to those waters which have that God has rebuked and created that path for the children of Israel. The Egyptians go in and pursue them in Exodus 14, and in verse 26 it says, "Yahweh said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea," so sort of a similar pattern at the beginning, "that the waters may return upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled against it." They're trying to return, and Yahweh overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. So loads of language there, and it says that they remain not so much as one. So this is really kind of an example, a really violent example of these seas, returning to their strength and absolutely destroying the Egyptians. And I think, again, because there's so many rare word links here that David is, through inspiration, putting into this psalm, he's drawing on those themes that we should go and look at. They're just little marker posts to tell us to go and look at an example of this. And this is what happens, isn't it? In verse 17 of Psalm 9, it says, "The wicked shall be returned to the grave, and all the nations that forget God." So there's two really strong links there, I think, with an example of where God wrought salvation in an incredibly difficult time. It must have been terrifying for the children of Israel. And they had to learn to trust in God, didn't
Mm.
they? So yeah, that's another one.
Yeah, it's interesting how this language is all coming through as you're showing. So all this Red Sea crossing language picking up. I guess for the people of Israel, that was one of the big major turning points when they became a nation. They came out from slavery and headed out to be God's people. That throughout history, they seem to always be referring back to that Red Sea crossing as a real turning point in their national and, I guess, individual history, because they wanted to. If it wasn't for that, they wouldn't be where they are today.
And I mean, yeah, absolutely. And we can continue to build these links through a couple of the bits I've already mentioned. Did you want to move on, or?
Yeah, let's keep going. So what we got next?
Okay, so staying on this theme of the children of Israel coming through the Red Sea, we move on to chapter 15 of Exodus, and we have the Song of Moses. And you know, it starts with this amazing kind of rejoicing, I suppose, in the way that they are so glad, I guess, that they've come through, and they're giving the glory to God. And it says in verse 3, Yahweh is a man of war, Yahweh is his name. And remember, we mentioned earlier about the name of Yahweh, and the psalm has it a couple of times, this idea of God's name. It says in verse 2, I will be glad in thee, and I will sing praise to thy name, O Most High, O thou Most High. And what does he do to the enemy's name? In verse 5, he destroys the wicked, thou hast put out their name forever and ever. And then we're told what we must do in verse 10 in relation to this. It says, they that know your name will put their trust in thee, for thou, Yahweh, hast not forsaken them that seek ye. So it's really important that we know God's name. And let's remind ourselves of the point of God wanting to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. And in Exodus 9, it says about Pharaoh. So this is what Moses was to say to Pharaoh, verse 13. And then he was to say in verse 16, and in very deed for this cause I have raised thee up, this is Pharaoh, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. So the whole point of him raising Pharaoh up was to make his name known throughout the whole earth. So it's super, super important. And I think that this fame of God's name is shown, how it was spread abroad after this event, through perhaps the Song of Moses, because we're perhaps familiar with things being passed from generation and news being passed by word of mouth. It wasn't like people had a smartphone, they could just read the latest tweet from the edge of the Red Sea. You know, it had to be word of mouth and the odd scroll, I suppose. And I think that is why we're given songs as well, because it's easier to remember some of those words. Certainly that's something that the Psalms are there, and we use them in hymns and songs to remember what God has done. So I think that this song travelled and was part of the way that what God has done was spread abroad. And just before we go and see that, I want to mention verse 18 of the psalm that says, for the needy shall not always be forgotten. I think you read the hope in your verse. Is that ESV that you read there?
Yep.
And that's helpful. The hope or expectation, EAV, for the poor shall not perish forever. So bear that bit in mind. And let's go to Joshua chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
It was helpful what you said, Matt, that you thought this was carried through as a song, and we find obviously it here in Psalm 9, which is almost like Scripture's songbook. So
Yeah,
interesting that
yeah.
it was recorded in that sense, as you said.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's definitely a reflection, isn't it? That all of that pattern is there. So we have Joshua sent the 2 men to spy out Jericho in Joshua 2, and they come to a harlot's house named Rahab, and they lodge there. So that's in verse 1. And she gives a confession of, I think, what she understands. And she wasn't with the children of Israel at this point. She was in a city many miles away. And what does she say in verse 9? She says, so one of the things to think about is when people that are not people of faith talk about the children of Israel's God, they don't often use his true name, Yahweh. They often say, oh, your God is a God of, and, don't know his Hebrew name in this way. But what does Rahab do in verse 9? She says unto the men, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side, Jordan, Sihon, and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our heart did melt. There was neither remain any more courage in any man because of you. For Yahweh, your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. I mean, that's quite an incredible confession of faith. And she has heard this. And that's what's important, I think. She hasn't read it, hasn't said that. And we read in the book of,
Exodus.
Yeah, well, of course. But, it's not like a newspaper that's come to them and told them the local press. She's heard it. And she is obviously affected by that, and the terror has come upon them. So it's quite a similar context in a way, because they're under threat of being destroyed by the children of Israel now, in the same way that Yahweh destroyed the Egyptians and these other kings.
Well, she's on the side of the enemies at this point, isn't she?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So I think that's really, really interesting. And then what the result of this, so I mentioned about the hope and the expectation, and again, that's quite rare. What do the spies say? They say in verse 18, behold, when we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line. That's an interesting translation, because it's a line of scarlet thread in the window, they say. But actually, when you look at all the places where it's translated, it's quite challenging, that translation. It's actually this word for hope or expectation that we see in the psalm. And so the psalm said, the needy shall not always be forgotten, the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. And obviously Rahab, this harlot in Jericho under threat of destruction, the spies say to her, thou shalt bind this hope of scarlet thread in the window, which thou didst let us down by, and thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's household home unto thee. And it shall be that whosoever shall go out the doors of the house into the street, his blood shall be upon his head, and we shall be guiltless. And whosoever shall be with thee in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if any man be upon him. So she does it. She binds this scarlet hope in her window. So I think that's really interesting, because it's also got this context of blood being upon the head. And you can think of the Passover and remaining in the house and all the elements of that. But also in the psalm makes a hint towards it in verse 12. It says, this is Yahweh, when he makes inquisition for blood, he remembers them, he forgetteth not the cry of the poor. So it's a really interesting pattern going on here, where there's this inquisition for blood that Yahweh's doing amongst his enemies, and here she will be spared that if she remains in the house and binds this hope of scarlet thread in the window, to show what she's been doing. And so you've got this wonderful coupling of her knowing the name of Yahweh, and she puts her trust in him. And as a result, in verse 18, the needy shall not be forgotten, the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. So I think the psalmist is starting, or David's starting, with the idea of saving the children of Israel, and what he did, he rebuked the nations and destroyed them. And then this remembrance of God's name and knowing it, and then that pattern is shown in Rahab later on, as she is then saved with this hope of salvation. So I think there's some really strong links there.
Fascinating. Wow. And then you can look at those faithful people to see how they reacted as well, to draw strength from. So what's been powerful for you, Jord, in this psalm that you think would be helpful for people to summarize?
I found all the links back to the children of Israel and to Rahab really helpful, man. I was just trying to think, well, how can I relate this to myself? And I just thought those 5 key words that you put up can really help me, that I do need to reflect and be joyful in the things that God has done. I do need to look at when I'm rebuked by him, when he's trying to teach me something in my life, as you were looking at with the enemies of the children of Israel. And I also need to know God's name, and a big part of that is reading his word, or reading the Psalms as we've looked at, and trying to live that and have that expectation that God can save and God will work in my life. So I think it's been really helpful that you've put those 5 key words up, and it was helpful that the first 3 all began with the letter R as well. Try and help us.
Wasn't by design.
So I've found that really helpful. I think this week I need to go in thinking about God and rejoicing in his name, and having that expectation that he is there for me, as you've alluded to throughout tonight with the context that you've looked back at in Exodus and Joshua. So thanks for your thoughts, Matt. That was really helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. And hopefully that's been helpful for you who've been watching that. May you remember, the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Those who know your name put their trust in you. God bless everyone, and looking forward to speaking to you again soon, God willing. Bye for now.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.